A topic of conversation that comes up more and more in my circles is that of grief, especially complicated and collective grief. In particular, most of us have not had much of a break to recognize and grieve the losses we've experienced over the last several years. The litany is long. Most recently, the pandemic brought us into contact with loss both intimate, with experiences that are unique to each of us, and unfathomably global, with at least 6 million deaths, and that's a number that's already likely much greater as we start to grapple with the meanings of excess mortality. We also need to take into account all the other losses we've experienced along the way, from a deterioration of our democratic ideals to the terrible strain on our education, health, and caregiving systems, to the shocking and deadly ignorance and disregard of public health, and so much more. Unfortunately, we didn't enter the pandemic with nothing else to think about or do. It's sometimes difficult to remember that the first year of the pandemic was also the last year of the Trump administration. The Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights has a timeline of that administration's near constant efforts to aggressively, in their words, turn back the clock on our nation's civil and human rights progress, from the Muslim ban in January of 2017 all the way to the 1776 Commission report in January of 2021. I copied and put that list, that timeline list, into a document with standard margins and 12-point font. It required 28 pages and more than 14,000 words. And this was just a list. This wasn't long explanations, just a list of events. This graphic is what that timeline looks like if you shrink down the text small enough to fit onto one slide. It's a tragic visual reminder of what we, especially anyone who belongs to a marginalized community, has had to endure. All of that is a lot to process, and we've not had the opportunity to stop, reflect, and grieve. Meanwhile, the experiences of loss, they just continue to pile up. This is especially true when you consider that all the pre-existing suffering didn't courteously pause so that we could focus on surviving a pandemic. Even before the barrage of the last 6 years, we were already and still are working to resist oppression and transform ourselves and communities. The result for many people, and I'd have to say an increasingly number of people at least who come to talk with me, is a sense of alienation. And our broader culture just doesn't provide a clear way of healing from that. Telling the truth about the world and how it impacts us is a practice, and it's just not an easy practice. As Lindo Bacon pointed out, it's hard to be yourself and feel belonging in a culture that is hostile to your very existence. And that's both biologically and psychologically true. We've known it experientially. We've felt it in our bodies, but it's also nice when we get some scientific data to affirm that and further deepen our work to understand what we felt inside of ourselves. We know, for example, that marginalized communities are more likely to suffer from social exclusion and isolation, which in turn is linked to poor health and life outcomes. We know that social exclusion limits opportunities in employment and education and even civic participation. George Monbiot summarized some of the best documented impacts of social exclusion and its resulting loneliness and isolation on human health. Beyond the more commonly known associations such as anxiety, depression, insomnia, and fear, he also noted that, quote, dementia, high blood pressure, heart disease, strokes, lowered resistance to viruses, even accidents are more common among chronically lonely people. Loneliness has a comparable impact on physical health to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It appears to raise the risk of early death by 26%. And that's partly because it enhances production of the stress hormone cortisol, which suppresses the human immune system. For a concrete example of how these health impacts are directly related to oppression, we can look back to an important study in 2012 published in the American Journal of Public Health titled Discrimination and the Stress Response. It detailed the impacts on Latina participants who anticipated racial discrimination or prejudice in an interaction. And those who braced themselves for encountering prejudice had a psychological and cardiovascular stress response. The authors explained it this way. If members of minority groups experience a stress response from the mere threat of discrimination, even in the absence of behavioral confirmation, over time, the repeated sympathetic nervous system and hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activation can contribute to allostatic load. This load, in turn, has been shown to be a predictor of a number of mental and physical health outcomes, including increases in anxious and depressive symptoms, as well as exacerbated cardiovascular response and decreased immunological functioning, both of which have deleterious consequences for long-term health and functioning. And let me put that in layman's terms. And that's simply, when a participant anticipated discrimination, they had a stress response. And previous studies had shown that that stress response was linked with a number of long-term risks for poor health. Psychologically, the response was correlated with anxiety and depression. Biologically, it was correlated with heart problems and a weakened immune system. The implication is that even when a marginalized person doesn't have a direct experience with discrimination or violence in a specific instance, just the awareness of the possibility of that kind of discrimination or violence and its likelihood to happen takes a toll on a person's well-being. As an aside, I just want to mention that there's an important practice related to this research that goes right along with this study, and that is believe marginalized people when they tell you that living in an oppressive society is harmful to them, even if they're not experiencing direct violence or discrimination. Our lives bear witness to this, and the research confirms it. And be patient if you get called out too, even if you think you've been misunderstood. The pain of being misunderstood is not greater than the pain of anticipating discrimination or violence. And these insights help us understand ourselves and also how we can most effectively work for change. It's obvious that directly experiencing oppression or marginalization or discrimination and violence is harmful. But this kind of research reminds us that even anticipating those experiences, that's also harmful. The stress of having to be constantly vigilant and alert undermines our well-being, both in our bodies and in our minds. We talk about this frequently in friend groups and support groups and online. It's one of the main reasons people who belong to marginalized communities so often move away from places like the Ozarks and hope that maybe there's some place to live that's a little less stressful. Living in a place like this where the marginalization is so often present is exhausting, and it's literally bad for our health. And this is an important part of the meaning of Lindo Bacon's words. It's hard to be yourself and feel belonging in a culture that's hostile to your existence. Changing that kind of culture, those systems, is very difficult, not least because we're often pressured to focus on and settle for merely individual changes. But self-help is insufficient. It's not enough. Even when individuals among us succeed in breaking free of that pattern, the pattern still exists, ready to marginalize more people. To put it another way, exceptions exist, but we don't want a wonderful life to be exceptional. We want the good things, medical care, education, employment, housing, food, the arts. We want those things available to everyone. Monbiot wisely puts this social exclusion and isolation into the context of oppressive systems, particularly noting the ideological impacts of neoliberal economics. He would write, "Though our well-being is inextricably linked to the lives of others, everywhere we are told that we'll prosper through competitive self-interest and extreme individualism. And these same ideas are intertwined with and then instrumental in sustaining and perpetuating other oppressive systems like racism. This kind of injustice and inaccessibility creates chronically unmet needs, especially in marginalized communities. In a supportive community, and I really hope you've had the pleasure of being part of a supportive community, in those kinds of communities, meeting our needs is something that occurs almost without thought. We recognize when we have a need, we know what options we have for meeting it, and we choose a strategy that we prefer. This is where humans flourish, where we can feel grateful and safe and surrounded by kindness and care. The social exclusion that accompanies marginalization and oppression breaks that healthy cycle, resulting in chronically unmet needs. And then we have to create all sorts of ways to creatively meet our needs in spite of the obstacles, or try to find ways to cope with the distress when we simply don't have the resources. Our physical needs and the injustice of poverty are probably the most obvious gaps, the easiest ones to notice, as so many people in our communities go without adequate housing or nutrition or transportation. However, that study on discrimination and the stress response highlights how other chronically unmet needs may be essentially hidden by our society systems and cultures. But just because they are hidden doesn't mean they don't exist. They do exist, and they create conditions that make us more vulnerable to the impacts of stressful living conditions and crises. This also means that oppression, marginalization, and discrimination, those are public health issues. And addressing them is essential to the long-term health of all of us as individuals and as a society. And I think of the many lessons we've hopefully learned from the pandemic is that we have to take public health seriously. And that means taking oppression and discrimination seriously. To quote Lindo Bacon again, this isn't to say that we should give up tugging on our own bootstraps or reaching for that next ladder rung. Rather, I'm pointing out how much easier it is to achieve when you have support networks. Our success depends more on our ability to leverage support and change our environment than it does on changing ourselves. My modest goal with this reflection is to bring these concepts back into, or maybe more into, our awareness. We talk a lot about justice here and advocating for changing ourselves and policies and institutions and cultures. We also reflect on how and why social change is so often difficult and slow. Our chronically unmet needs are one part of that equation. The difficult reality is that many, maybe most of us, have spent our lives in communities that made it more difficult for us to thrive and flourish as human beings. And it's also very likely that we've picked up on those very habits, that we've learned to mistreat ourselves and mistreat others, mistreat the earth. We add to that the exhaustion that comes from suffering from and resisting and transforming oppression, and the odds just seem to be stacked against us. Being in community in these conditions is just hard work, especially if we're breaking destructive patterns that have lived around and maybe even inside of us for a long time. It's just really difficult to sustain movements for change when you can't, to return to Bacon's words, be yourself in a wider culture that is hostile to your existence. And yet, we still carry inside of us this conviction that it's possible for us to live together in such a way that everybody can flourish, and the aspiration to make that so. Each of us can look at our lives and communities to find ways in which we can leverage support and change our environment so that everyone, especially marginalized folks, get more space to feel and be safe, and get some relief from constant stress, and grow in confidence that our needs do matter and that our needs can be met. The exact changes will vary according to our circumstances, but the aspiration itself is something that we can each develop. For example, Bacon did not stop in that initial quote in which I quoted them by observing that it's tough to feel belonging in a culture that's hostile to your existence. They then invited us to do this. Think of someone you love. I'm willing to bet that when you think about the people you cherish, it's probably your dearest wish that they have access to every tool and opportunity possible to be themselves, be loved, and flourish in a welcoming world. This is a very simple practice we can cultivate in order to train our minds to pay attention both to marginalized voices and needs and to opportunities to realign resources and opportunities that allow everyone to be themselves, be loved, and flourish in a welcoming world. Think about someone you care about, your best wishes for them, the resources you want them to have, the opportunities you want them to have. And then let your heart open up and want those things for everybody. The best way for the person you cherish to have access to every tool and opportunity possible to be themselves is to make sure everyone has that access. We can use this standard of human flourishing to measure how well we are practicing justice, equity, and goodwill as a community. Shifts like this, little practices like these, that's a part of creating communities and movements that aren't as vulnerable to burnout or internal conflict or similar issues. The world was already difficult, filled with oppression and injustice before the pandemic, before the Trump administration. But we have collectively faced some of our deepest fears, anger, uncertainty, and loss over the past 6 years. In the midst of that pain, many of us are teetering on the edge of giving up, becoming sensitive to and understanding that very real pain that comes from exclusion, marginalization, and its resulting loneliness is an important part of making belonging possible again. Being increasingly sensitive to and aware of both how we are hurt and how we're complicit in hurting others helps us deepen that commitment to break harmful patterns, because healing takes time and effort. Building trust takes time and effort. Belonging takes time and effort. We let go of that which harms us and others, even as we take up that which frees us to live, love, and enjoy life deeply, to have deeply meaningful lives. I began by mentioning that complicated and collective grief has been a persistent topic of conversations in my circles lately, and I have felt my own fragility as I sit with people who are hurting. I wanted to share some stories about that, but as I sat to write out these reflections, I didn't even know how or where to begin. But maybe a story gives me a place to end. One night just this week, I sat with a good friend. After a particularly difficult and hopefully healing conversation, processing hopelessness and loneliness and loss of meaning, we sang some folk songs by Malvina Reynolds and Leslie Fish. We played hand drums and laughed as we remembered and misremembered the lyrics. Malvina's song, God Bless the Grass, particularly moved me. God bless the grass that grows through the crack. They roll the concrete over it and try to keep it back. The concrete gets tired of what it has to do. It breaks and it buckles, and the grass grows through. And God bless the grass. God bless the grass that grows through cement. It's green and it's tender and it's easily bent. But after a while, it lifts up its head. For the grass is living and the stone is dead. And God bless the grass. By facing that grief together, my friend and I could transform an opportunity for isolation into an opportunity for connection. And moments like that are part of that process where step by step, we learn to create communities where a wonderful life is not just for a few of us, where a wonderful life is not exceptional. Instead, we learn we can create a world where everyone can have access to every tool and opportunity possible to be themselves, be loved, and flourish. This is why we keep working together, honestly facing our losses and moving forward despite being bent over by grief. We know that this is possible. We can create communities where each of us is lifted up and a wonderful life is accessible to each one of us. Thank you for being part of a community committed to doing just that.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.